But first, do you remember Brian Sicknick, Officer Brian Sicknick? He was the officer who was tragically killed during the Trump riots, the insurrection that happened at the Capitol. This is what many of us had been told for a long time. This man he was killed, as the report said, with a fire extinguisher, that the Trump mob, the angry Trump mob, took a fire extinguisher and brutally beat this man to death. He was then hailed, obviously, as a hero for his actions and laid in. They had him in the rotunda to honor him. And it turns out that Officer Brian Sicknick, did not die from being bludgeoned to death with a fire extinguisher like the news was trying to get us to believe for so long. So if you remember, all in total, they were saying that there were 7 people. The number first started out, 5 people were killed during the Trump riot. And then that number grew to 7, is what much of the media was kind of touting. They were saying 7 people died. This was a deadly riot. 7 people died. But the circumstances of those deaths matter, right? 2 of the 7 were people who ultimately ended up committing suicide. Sure, I think there was probably some sadness, or, obviously if they felt like they had to reach that point in their lives, there was some sadness, maybe there was some regret. I'm not exactly sure what the circumstances were around those 2 who ended up deciding to take their own lives, but it is very tragic. And it was somehow in connection to the rally, the riot, the insurrection, whatever it is you want to call it. 3 others died from what they called medical emergencies. There was one gentleman who died of a heart attack, one who died of a stroke, and the other was a woman in her 30s who had passed out suddenly during the riots, and she was unfortunately stampeded by the crowds. Although there are some disputes on that, I think some members that were there said that no, she had just suddenly collapsed, and that members had started doing CPR on her, but they were unable to revive her. And so as of this point, I believe her family says that the cause of death is still unknown. But even if it was that she was trampled to death, unfortunately, and inadvertently by the crowd during the storming of the Capitol, that is obviously very tragic. But that is something that happens, unfortunately, when you're in these crowds and people are rushing in. We see this happen on Black Friday, and it's a very dangerous and terrible way to die, and a dangerous activities to be involved in a crowd that's trying to get into some place. It's not the place you want to be. We also saw Ashli Babbitt was shot to death in the neck by a Capitol police officer. She was unarmed. She did break into the Capitol. However, I do not believe that breaking and entering deserves a death sentence. So that is something that we say about a lot of the deaths we see at the hands of police officers all around the country. We say this was an unarmed person. Maybe they committed a small crime, but that crime did not deserve the death penalty. I believe that about Ashli Babbitt. It was extremely unfortunate, and there's not much outrage about it, sadly, when maybe there should be. And then the last one was Brian Sicknick. They were saying that he was bludgeoned to death by a fire extinguisher. Now, he was the only death out of all of those 7 that was a direct death at the hands of this angry, vicious mob. So the media was very much, they were really honing in on this story, and they were saying this is the one because this just shows how violent, angry, and deadly this mob is. They are vicious killers. They don't care about people. They certainly don't care about cops, even though they claim they do. They bludgeoned this man to death with a fire extinguisher. That's how he died. And that is what the media ran with. And we heard that story over and over and over again. And even last night when I was talking, actually every night whenever I talk about the Capitol riots, somebody inevitably brings up Officer Brian Sicknick and says, Kim, a cop was killed. These people murdered him. But it turns out that is actually not true. Let me show you this story. This is from Yahoo News. They said right here, the Times corrects the record on Officer Sicknick's death, sort of. So let me show you this. This is let me show you this article. So here it is. And it says right here, a few days ago, the New York Times quietly updated its report published over a month earlier, asserting that Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick had been killed by being struck with a fire extinguisher during the January 6th riot. According to the update, new information has emerged regarding the death of the Capitol Police after Brian Sicknick that questions the initial cause of his death provided by officials close to the Capitol Police. As I detailed in a column last week, what the Times calls new information actually began emerging the same day the paper filed its January 8th report. So here we are. We're now it's February 16th. These reports are now coming out, I would say, in the last week that Brian Sicknick did not die from the fire extinguisher, that the autopsy report for Brian Sicknick actually showed no trauma whatsoever to his body, no blunt force trauma, no trauma at all. So he did not die from being bludgeoned or trampled or shoved. There was no physical reason for his death by physical exertion of somebody else. So the autopsy report has come back at this point inconclusive. They don't know why he died. At first, they said it was a stroke, potentially, that he also died of a stroke, is similar to the other person. And other reports are saying that they're speculating now that maybe he died from some chemical. Maybe it was pepper spray that killed him. So they're not sure, actually. And the reports as of today are still inconclusive for Brian Sicknick. But the worst part about this, and this article goes on, and let me show you more of this article. It says right here, that report was and still is entitled, quote, Capitol Police Officer Dies from Injuries in Pro-Trump Rampage. So that is the Times article that is called Capitol Police Officer Dies from Injuries in Pro-Trump Rampage. It was not the only such Times report from that day. There was another entitled, quote, He dreamed of being a police officer, then was killed by a pro-Trump mob, in which the Times asserted, quote, on Wednesday, pro-Trump supporters attacked that citadel of democracy, the Capitol, overpowered Mr. Sicknick, 42, and struck him in the head with a fire extinguisher, according to two law enforcement officials. With a bloody gash in his head, Mr. Sicknick was rushed to the hospital and placed on life support. He died on Thursday evening. Yet, as early as the morning of January 8th, KHOU in Houston reported that Sicknick had died from a stroke. The KHOU story made no mention of the officer being struck by a fire extinguisher. It did claim, however, that the stroke occurred at the Capitol during the riots, and a caption under the officer's photograph stated that he died of injuries sustained during the riot at the Capitol. The headline of the KHOU story attributes the conclusion that a stroke was the cause of death to the head of the Capitol Police Union, Gus Papanthanzau. The body of the story identified Papanthanzau. I'm not saying this right? Papanthanzio. I don't know, guys. As its source for what turned out to be the erroneous report that Sicknick had passed away during the day on Thursday, the day of the riot. In fact, he was still on life support at that time, was pronounced dead late Thursday night. So essentially what they had found was that here was another one. It said in a CNN report, actually, according to unidentified law enforcement officials, medical examiners had found no evidence of blunt force trauma on Sicknick's body and concluded the fire extinguisher account was not true. So here's the thing. The Times knew about this information, apparently, according to this Yahoo News journalist, who's much more of a journalist, clearly, than those at the Times, because this woman actually was, let me see who, I don't know if I can see who actually wrote this one. I'm pretty sure. So this was a gentleman. Andrew McCarthy wrote this one, who is that? That's not isn't there an Andrew McCarthy that was the, no, I'm thinking of somebody else. Anyway, this person is obviously much more of a journalist than the Times, because this person is actually showcasing that, first of all, you should wait for the evidence. You shouldn't just go based on claims that are out there and then continue to assert that story over and over and over again. There was never any video evidence of the fire extinguisher hitting this man over the head. And we are talking about a heavily surveillanced building. So they have footage of every single corner and crevice of the Capitol grounds. So if there was a moment where this man was hit in the head with a fire extinguisher, there would have been video footage of that, but there never was. And So they never had any actual proof of this, and instead they ran with this story. They used it in order to turn the public's opinion on this protest that had turned somewhat violent, and definitely not any more violent than the protests we saw this summer. Certainly not. But they used this to say, no, these people were abhorrent. They were beyond insurrectionists. They were murderers. And then they had images of, there's all these debunked now stories where they say, oh, they've got this guy who showed up with zip ties and he was going to actually tie up Congress people and he was going to kidnap them and whatnot. And that ended up not being a true story either. It turned out that guy found the zip ties in the Capitol complex and he picked them up and he ran off with them because he said he didn't want police officers to use them on the protesters. So he actually did not bring the zip ties to the event that day. He found the zip ties in the Capitol and wanted to make sure that they wouldn't be used on the people. So there's all of these false stories that have been circulating about this in order to really make this insurrection a bigger deal than it really was. And as this evidence kind of starts to come out, and of course, whenever there's a retraction, no one ever reads the retraction. Everyone just hears the story, but they don't hear the corrections to that story later, right? We don't hear now so much about Brian Sicknick. We heard all about him. The news covered his death. CNN was even getting on Fox News's rear end about it because they were saying, oh, they didn't cover his when he was, I forgot what it's called, the lion, something at the rotunda. They didn't cover that. And so, which they did, but they were saying, oh, you didn't cover it for very long. You only covered it for just a few minutes and we were covering it for hours. So these networks use this death, this poor guy's death, and he has a family and he has people who love him. And now how embarrassing is it for them that the whole world has been told that this man was killed by this angry, vicious, violent Trump mob. And it turns out that's not the case. Now the autopsy is coming back to this family that's grieving the loss of their loved one. This is how disgusting this is. This family is grieving the loss of their loved one. And the world has used their loved one's death as a political talking point, a story, in order to fuel the flames some more. And then they're finding out that he didn't die, in fact, the way that the media purports that he died. And that when he was in the rotunda and they did all of these great honors for him, then his family has to sit there and think, well, was it all kind of a lie, right? Because it turns out that he actually died of something else and they're not really even quite sure. Maybe it was a stroke or maybe, whatever it was that he passed away from. At the age of 42, unfortunately, strokes and heart attacks are not uncommon. And any strenuous activity is going to potentially bring on a stroke or a heart attack. I mean, you could shovel snow. That was one of the big ones that would actually cause men heart attacks. Shoveling snow, having sex. These things give you strokes and heart attacks. Anything that is going to elevate your heart rate, bring on excitement, that sort of thing is going to give you more, is going to potentially bring about one of these unfortunate medical events. But we still actually don't know what killed this guy. But what we do know is it wasn't a fire extinguisher by an angry, violent mob of Trump supporters who were going around just seeking to kill people. That's not what happened. So it turns out that of all of the 7 deaths that happened at the Capitol insurrection, whatever you want to call it, that none of them died at the hands of this vicious pro-Trump mob. That not a single one of them died because this vicious pro-Trump mob was murderous. No one died at the hands of these people directly. There were people that involved at the event either took their own lives or had a medical event happen in the excitement of it all. And then there was Ashli Babbitt, and she was the only one who was actually truly killed by another person. And that was at the hands of a person defending the Capitol building. And now it's interesting to see the left now saying, well, he was doing his job when, any other story about somebody who's unarmed getting shot by a police officer, especially in the middle of an activity that would not warrant a death penalty. It's interesting now to see how the narratives so quickly change and how people so quickly switch sides. But That is the truth of what is going on right now is that all of these news outlets are sort of correcting the record. CNN has sort of corrected the record about Brian Sicknick. New York Times, all of these different journalist outlets, so-called journalist outlets, are correcting the record, but the damage has been done. Most people are not going to hear about this story. Most people are going to believe that an angry, violent, pro-Trump mob murdered this man by bludgeoning him to death with a fire extinguisher.